All right, so today we're taking a look at the brand new iPhone 16 Pro Max, and we're comparing it to the Google Pixel 9 Pro XL, as well as the Samsung S24 Ultra. Right now we're recording using the front-facing cameras. We're at 4K 30 frames per second. And as we go through this test, we will switch through the 3 different microphones so you guys can hear that comparison as well. And as you guys can see, I got the sun directly behind me right now. So you're seeing how these cameras handle aggressive backlighting. And then if I just kind of turn this way, you can see how that sun looks when it's directly in front of me. So let me know which one you guys think looks the best down in the comment section below. All right, so aside from that selfie video comparison, the next thing I want to take a look at is overall dynamic range. So in this shot right here, clearly you can see we have the sun in the upper left-hand corner really impeding into our shot. I think with Samsung and Google, you're getting more of that washed out look because of the sun. I think the iPhone footage really stands out here. Even with that aggressive sun, the image looks a lot more balanced. All the way from the highlights, the midtones, the shadows, you just have a lot more detail. And to me, it just looks the most pleasing to the eye. The next thing we're going to take a look at is some side-by-side photo examples to compare the difference as far as color science. At this point, I don't think it's much of a surprise to say that Samsung is typically going to give you more aggressive contrast and saturation. That's been a theme with Samsung phones for quite a while. So normally you're going to notice bluer skies, greener grass, greener trees, things of that nature. Aside from that, I think the 3 phones stack up pretty well. Now moving over to some portrait mode examples, the first thing I always look at is skin tone. As far as consistency, especially for somebody of color, I feel like the Pixel gets it right more times than not. With the iPhone, I feel like you get a lot more yellow in the skin tones, which is not always flattering. Aside from that, I think the Pixel gives you a softer, almost dreamy type of look. The depth of field bokeh effect is usually stronger as well. You'll also notice some differences as far as contrast and things of that nature. I think all 3 look great. It really just comes down to personal preference. From there, let's get into some telephoto examples. When it comes to taking pictures from a distance, I think Samsung and Google generally clean up the images a little bit better compared to the iPhone. If you look at the shirt in this particular example, I think it looks a bit more grainy and washed out on the iPhone, and actually the image as a whole just looks a bit more washed out as well. Now moving over to another example, we've got a little sign there in the distance. Switching over to the main wide angle camera, you can see it a little bit better, and then we zoom in much further. And in this example, I think all 3 did a great job. The saturation on the Samsung is a bit much, but aside from that, you can clearly read the words on all 3. We've got a similar example, again, another sign in the distance. And when we zoom in, this time taking a closer look, I don't know, I think the Pixel kind of cleans up the image the best, and the iPhone looks noticeably noisier. Now moving over to some video examples, right here we've got the 5x telephoto lenses, and when we take a closer look, I think all 3 really look good. I mean, the main difference just comes down to white balance and just overall color, but as far as detail and resolution, I think they look great. Aside from that, the one thing that stands out to me is that the shadows are lifted a bit more on the iPhone. Now getting into some max zoom video examples, I think the Pixel looks more digital compared to the other 2. And even though you don't have quite as much reach on the iPhone, personally, I think the iPhone and the Samsung footage looks a little bit better. Again, the Pixel just looks very digital when you're zooming in that far. Now moving over to some low light / nighttime examples, right here we're testing the selfie cameras, and I really like the overall exposure and look of the Pixel footage. But one thing I have noticed is that you tend to get more noise in the darker areas of the shot. If you take a closer look at my black sweater, you can see that the iPhone has the least amount of noise, followed by the Samsung and then the Pixel. If you look at the darker areas above my head, I think you can really see some of that noise there as well. Now switching over to another example, this time with the ultra wide cameras, it's pretty much the same thing. If you look at the darker area surrounding the sign, you can really see how each phone handles that noise. Aside from that, I think the Pixel tends to lift the shadows a little bit more compared to Samsung and iPhone. You can really see it in this shot if you focus on the top of the frame. Now, something else I've noticed is that the Samsung and the iPhone are a bit more responsive to very bright sources in low light situations. As you can see in this shot, there's a giant big screen TV across the way, and the Samsung and the iPhone were able to adjust the exposure accordingly, and the Pixel didn't. And as a result, you can see that the screen for the most part is blown out. Moving over to some photo examples, what stands out to me in this shot is that you're getting some pretty harsh reflections on the iPhone as well as the Pixel coming from the bulbs on that sign. You don't really notice it on the Samsung. Aside from that, I think the Pixel handled the exposure of the sign the best, followed by the Samsung and then the iPhone. The iPhone is obviously much brighter. In this example, there's a very similar sign. So again, you're noticing those reflections coming from the Pixel and the iPhone. I think one thing that's pretty consistent is that the Samsung and the Pixel keep things a bit darker, whereas the iPhone tends to lift the shadows a bit more. You can definitely see it in this example. If you're looking at the foreground where the sidewalk is, it's a lot brighter on the iPhone. Now moving over to some slow motion examples. Obviously the big upgrade with the iPhone is 4K 120. With Samsung, we already had 4K 120. So you're going to notice more detail on the Samsung and the iPhone. With the Pixel, you're still limited to 1080p. Another example, just me doing a LeBron style powder toss with some corn. And again, you're going to notice a little bit more detail on the Samsung as well as the iPhone. So when it comes to slow motion action shots, those two have the advantage. From there, let's get into some cinematic mode, portrait video, and blur mode examples. And one thing I've noticed when using these modes is that the iPhone tends to handle focus for humans a little bit better. Their software does a great job of keeping the focus locked onto the person in frame, even when the camera might be moving. Sometimes with Samsung, a person's face might be in focus, but then parts of their body aren't. Aside from that, the one thing to point out is that the Pixel downgrades to 1080p when using the blur mode, and Samsung and iPhone are able to stay in 4K. Now, as far as macro mode, I think all three phones do a great job of capturing subjects up close, but one thing I'll say is that the user experience is a little bit faster on the iPhone. It just seems to identify the subject and lock focus faster than the other two. With the Samsung and the Pixel, I found myself tapping the screen to identify the subject and the focal point a lot more compared to the iPhone. A very minor difference, but it is something that I've noticed. And lastly, let's take a look at some stabilization examples. Here we have a basic walking test, and I do feel like the Samsung and the iPhone are a bit more stable compared to the Pixel, but I think the playing field is more level when you switch over to the more advanced stabilization modes. So right here, we're doing a jogging stabilization test, and I think all three phones do a pretty decent job. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to consider when it comes to comparing these phones and their camera's abilities, but hopefully from a strictly point and shoot perspective, this video gives you some insight as far as which one you might prefer. So if you found this video helpful in the least, please do me a favor, give it a thumbs up. Also consider subscribing to the channel. And aside from that, I appreciate you guys as always, and I'll see you in the next one.